sorry, I can't say that. Hello. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Nick, how are you?
I've blown it already, haven't I?
You have,
I'm not
as
going to
always.
mention Halloween, bats, pumpkins, ghosts, anything like that, because you have to edit it out. So I do apologise.
Yeah, or reindeer, or
Reindeer.
coming up soon.
Just get it all out. Just get it all out now.
Hello, Anita. Welcome to you as well.
Hello, Nick and Alan. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Fantastic. It hadn't started very well. Hopefully it's going to get better. So, Alan, how are you since the last time we podcasted?
Yeah, good. Busy. Setting up Coaching Loop and doing a couple more of these in our podcast bank. So yeah, we're all good. All good.
It's really lovely to introduce Anita here. She's going to be our expert on neurodiversity in coaching, which is something that me and Alan have been keen to get into our noggins for some time now. I have to apologise to Anita, and she doesn't mind me talking about her neurodiversity. She's very open about it, that I didn't actually, because I was so rushed, give her enough time to plan for this session. And we had to then go, sorry about that. Yeah, people who are neurodiverse sometimes need a bit more planning time. So how ironic is that? But have I learned from it? Very much.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And do you know, I think actually this has really allowed me to lean into the ADHD part of me, because I am ADHD. I received a diagnosis of autism and ADHD a few years ago. And what I'm finding is that being more spontaneous and not planning as much is allowing me to work with the ADHD parts of me that actually quite thrive on something that isn't very structured and formatted. And the autistic part of me needs that. So I think for me, it'll be really interesting to see what happens when we're just going with the flow.
Fantastic. Thank you for being so open and forgiving of my miscommunication. So I want to start off with just a few thoughts around school and neurodiversity, having been in education for a long time. I think it's not positive in many ways. I think that education is a bit narrow. It's a little bit too constrained around reading and writing and sat in rows in desks. Hasn't changed for 200 years. Bloody, bloody, blah. I don't want to labour that point too much with all my ex-teaching colleagues grunting and groaning at what I'm saying, but it's true. And I think one of the populations that struggle with that are people that are neurodiverse and special needs. And that cultural bias against the normal student, which is just ridiculous because there are no normal students, it still pervades. And I think that there are a lot of stereotypes and caricatures around what ADHD might mean. I think that the fact that adults can't get diagnosed very easily, and I think that there's that stigma around it, there's a lot of negativity. What's your feeling on that, Anita? Have I been too negative?
No, because I think actually some sort of negativity leads to action. I think we have to be realistic and see what the flaws are, the way in which the system needs to change so that we can actually have better outcomes for our children going forwards. And I think being a fellow teacher, a lot of that does resonate in terms of how classrooms and the curriculum essentially are designed with a one-size-fits-all approach. And if you do think a little bit differently, if you do perhaps process and receive information in a different manner, and then as a result, you have certain ideas of what you think is problem solving, creativity, etc., which more often than not is seen as being disruptive or deviant. And so I think if we can get it right from the beginning and be more proactive rather than reactive with what we introduce from a very young age and then into workplaces, we can see that consistent message following through so people can work at their best rather than simply coping.
Thank you. Really, I think I've skipped a step in our planning because I was so excited to talk about education that I didn't give you a chance to introduce yourself. And you know, Alan and I love a metaphor. We did talk about that beforehand. So can you tell us a bit about who you are, how you got to where you are, and what gets you out of bed in the morning? And you have a lovely metaphor around a flower that I would love to hear more about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I come from an education background. So I was a teacher for nearly 20 years and really got to see firsthand where the journey begins for neurodivergent individuals. And on top of that, I'm also a parent and carer to two neurodivergent teenagers. So initially, when I decided to start my own business, which was a few years ago, so I left the kind of the classroom environment to set up a coaching business. And I started off coaching and mentoring neurodivergent young people and families, because, of course, I was able to bring that direct experience into our sessions. And then I discovered my own neurodivergence amongst all of that. So I was able to bring the lived experience in. However, that soon turned to working not just on a one-to-one basis, but with teams and organizations, and really trying to think about what neuro-inclusion looks like, but very much through an intersectional lens. So that's a real passion of mine, seeing the diversity within neurodiversity and all of those intersecting identities, how that experiences, how we show up, and, for example, our access to support.
That's lovely. That idea of the diversity within the diversity is lovely, and that resonates with the phrase that I came across in education increasingly before I left, which was we're all on the spectrum. And I like the idea that there is no normal, that whatever way you want to sort people or filter people, we're all so different. So it'd be interesting to hear how that diversity within diversity and the intersectionality of it, is that the word? How that plays out in a coaching environment. But I think Alan was very keen to jump in. He hasn't spoken yet.
And can I do need to mention something about being on the spectrum, because all of us being on the spectrum, because that can be triggering for certain people. So we're going to have to address that. And I would address it in a really nice way, bring in something, because I think that's a real thing, a real trigger point for neurodivergent people in the community. So I can give a response in a certain way that kind of then lends itself to, this is how we could potentially look at it. So I'd love to respond to that. And also what you said about the flower thing, I'd love to mention a bit around that as well. But Alan, please come in.
No, all it was really around, you'd got so far in your life without having a diagnosis.
Yes.
Were you aware, or what was the catalyst to go get a diagnosis? And then how did that influence you? I'm going to use the word influence rather than change or challenge or whatever. But how did that influence you in your thought process after that diagnosis?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question, and something that I come back to on a frequent basis, because I often say to people, yes, you may obtain a formal diagnosis. You may not, because of various barriers to receiving one. And they could be numerous. It could be the waiting lists on the NHS, whether you're able to pay for something privately, the kind of barriers you face in your community to obtaining a diagnosis. And so for me, I managed to kind of get one for myself because I think I was armed with a lot of what I needed and what I was seeing to then be absolutely sure that it was the right thing for me. I think I would have second guessed myself if I hadn't seen what I'd seen, which was essentially going through a chemical menopause as a result of breast cancer treatment. So I had a breast cancer diagnosis 6 years ago, and then I was put into an overnight chemical menopause due to the treatment that I was on. And that made it incredibly difficult to mask my neurodivergence.
Okay.
So it became very apparent that I was experiencing certain things from being autistic, having ADHD, particularly in the classroom environment. So on a sensory level, and, the executive functioning side. All of that was becoming really challenging for me. So I had a lot of kind of evidence, I suppose, to be able to kind of take to the assessment of examples, things that I was actually struggling with. Whereas had I tried to go for that maybe 20 or 30 years ago, yes, it would have helped in some ways for me to navigate certain situations in my life. But I'm not sure if I would have maybe had enough to be able to share because I was masking a lot.
Okay. That's really interesting. And I guess there's an awful lot, and I know we're desperate to get onto the flower metaphor. I guess there's an awful lot of people who using the word mask to make up for something that's underlying that they're probably aware of, but not openly and can't explain, will cope. I don't know whether that's the right word, but will mask through their coping in certain situations, either putting themselves forward or not, or standing back, or however it manifests itself for them. They will mask based on, I guess, their learnt experience as well of what they can do, what they can't do, what they can get away with within their workplace or school environment or home life. And we get to that point where your coping mechanism or your masking kind of counteracts certain areas. I just find it fascinating that certain people can get to certain points in their life and mask because they innately know they have to. Whereas I think, and again, you talked about 20, 30 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation at all 20, 30 years ago. We wouldn't dare raise the M word within this as well. So I think culture and in society's moved on so far that we're quite open to discussing this for the starters. Then we're bringing words in like masking, and then we're bringing other words in. And I just find it absolutely fascinating how we've moved as society. People still mask, still do certain things certain ways so they don't have to raise their other people's awareness of who they are innately.
Yeah, absolutely. And some form of masking is okay. I think it would be unrealistic to expect someone to completely unmask in all situations when they've had years of having to adapt to, for example, a neurotypical world. If you are neurodivergent, you develop certain ways of fitting in and belonging. And some elements of masking where you are showing up for something and you are, in inverted commas, making it work because that's your job, for example, that's in your job description. And there are some things you may just have to do. But you can ask for reasonable adjustments. You can start to disclose a little bit more if there is, for example, psychological safety. And you can start to unravel certain parts that actually would be helpful for you to be able to thrive. But I think continuous masking and suppression of neurodivergence over consecutive years does lead to co-occurring mental health challenges. And that definitely happened for me. So I would say that my mental health and well-being was significantly impacted by having to constantly mask about everything. So not just in my job, but for example, in the home environment, and saying, you know what, everything's fine. Everything's fine. Everything's okay. I can do this. I can be the mom that juggles everything, the wife, I go out and work and I can kind of, everything's possible. But actually now with this new understanding, I can start to advocate for myself a little bit more. And I would say my well-being is positively impacted because of that. And that's another reason why a lot of adults are misdiagnosed. So they may present as having social anxiety, depression, for example, but actually there's this underlying neurodivergence that's being missed.
That's really interesting, Anita, and it fits really clearly, doesn't it, with the ideas of incongruence in psychology, that if there's something in there that is clunky and doesn't fit, it won't serve you well in the long term. And can you please tell us about your flower?
Absolutely. So one of my favorite quotes when it comes to thinking about neuro-inclusion is, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And I often use this analogy because if we think of a flower and simply giving it the kind of basics of what it needs to be able to grow, that's the kind of baseline of neuro-inclusion that everybody should have, the good practice. But actually, for that flower to bloom and really thrive, you can add some additional things. And, that for me is really the ideal place to be, where you're not simply use the word coping earlier. And I think many neurodivergent people feel that that is their default way. They are managing to survive and cope in a world that wasn't designed for them. But I also see individuals who are absolutely excelling their potential, because not only do they have that baseline there, but they have these additional things that are put into place with regards to, for example, their environment, because environment is so important for neurodivergent people. If you make certain adaptations there, it's incredible what that can do. So for me, it's very much that metaphor of this flower blooming with everything else around it to kind of allow for that. Whereas if it doesn't get the basics of what it needs, it will wilt, and it will eventually kind of, in a more extreme way, will die. It will no longer be kind of able to do what it needs to do. So yeah, that definitely is my go-to quote for lots of things.
And I guess you mentioned the environment there as well, and a flower growing in Western Wales as opposed to a flower growing in Eastern Anglia needs different things, because the host environment is different. It might be the pH in the soil, it might be the acidity in the rain, it might be the amount of wind or the ambient temperature all year. So all those things, even though it's the same plant, still needs completely different care depending on where it is.
Absolutely. And that actually leads really nicely to something that would be really great to share, which is the distinction between neurodiverse and neurodivergent. So we are all neurodiverse. Neurodiversity exists everywhere. And so all of us can benefit from a baseline approach to allow for different thinking styles, for example. But if we are being neuro-inclusive, we are thinking about the 20% likely more of the population who are neurodivergent and will need a particular level of understanding, a certain kind of approach to be able to work at their best. And so, yeah, I think, we are all absolutely flowers you can grow with the right things around us. But as you, I love that sort of analogy around the soil, Alan, that actually neurodivergent individuals may need a completely different sort of baseline soil environment and then everything around them. And by that, I mean reasonable adjustments, which do look different if you are amongst that 20 or more percent. What you need to be able to thrive will require a different level of understanding. And that's why neuro-inclusion training is so important. In fact, in my opinion, it should be mandatory everywhere.
100% agree with that. And what I'm hoping to get from you today is to move on my understanding and add some nuance, because having been a teacher with 30 children with a curriculum or a syllabus, to become a coach, the freedom to personalize is just wonderful. It isn't one size fits all. However, of course, if you have coaching and coaching models and coaching approaches, they might end up being a clunky, clumsy one size fits all themselves, couldn't they? So what I'm interested in getting from you, and I've got an example from my own practice that I'd like you to reflect on, is a bit more nuance around that. So I've got my first adult diagnosed autistic coachee who I've been working with. And when I started working with them, the first thing that happened was they had some doubt about whether it would be effective based on some bad experiences. And I said, well, from my point of view as an ex-teacher, I'd like to think that I'm used to a diverse range of people and no one's normal. I think that was a good starting point. And then I said, so what would you like? And they said just two things. One, my emotional regulation is not that good sometimes. So I'd like a bit of time if I am thinking or saying or behaving in a way to unpick it a bit more. So, and I love the whole CBC approach. So for me, that was an easy win, low-hanging fruit, really. And they said, and can I have 45-minute sessions? Because after that, my bandwidth just goes off a cliff. So I was able to take both of those two things on and employ them. And I think it's been really, really effective. And the thing that happened that we hadn't planned for that was even more effective was I always send an email after every session, confidential summary of session, and I just say, nice to see you. I thought you engaged really well. We talked about so-and-so, and you thought you might do so-and-so between now and the next time. And it was just a few bullet points, really, and I'll keep it simple just to make life easy for myself. The feedback from the coachee was, wow, never had that before from my sessions, and they have had coaching before. That was so simple, and it made it such an easy framework to remember. And it made me think, wow, don't all coaches do that? Because if they don't, that's not very professional, because that's an easy thing to do. And it's a basic thing that all coaches should be doing, but clearly they're not. So what other nuance is there to go in my top tips of how to look after my work when I'm working with people who are neurodivergent?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you've described there, Nick, is a really, really important part of neurodivergent individuals. You know, their experiences. Emotional regulation has a huge impact on everything else. And so helping with levels of regulation, whatever that looks like, and learning to spot the signs can make a massive difference. So, you know, as we said earlier, being proactive rather than reactive when that person is fully dysregulated, for example, and won't be able to work at their best. So learning how to spot those signs by working together closely and imagining what good emotional regulation looks like and the opposite. And what you've described about kind of following up after sessions, a lot of coaches are taught in a very traditional sense. A lot of the models are more conducive to, for example, a neurotypical way of working. So, for instance, it may be suggested that, you know, as a coach, you shouldn't be sending things after the session because the person needs to be in control and needs to be taking lots of notes. That's not always appropriate. If you are working with a neurodivergent individual, they may be taking a bit of time to process. They may not be able to write everything down. They may want to have sort of bullet points or a summary afterwards, which is absolutely fine. And, you know, with their permission, we can build in this scaffolding between coaching sessions to allow them to have that clarity. And in addition to what you've described about the emotional regulation, there's energy accounting, which is absolutely huge. For neurodivergent individuals to be able to account for fluctuations in energy levels can be really helpful. So I use a withdrawals and deposits approach. So we talk about how many withdrawals have taken place, how many deposits have been injected, and is there an imbalance? And has that imbalance then caused a ripple effect for the coming weeks and months? So yeah, absolutely. There is a lot that we can be doing when we think of good practice, but also there is a lot of training around. And I run some currently for coaches specifically. I really encourage people to get CPD as a kind of bolt-on to their additional coaching qualifications so that they can see different ways of working. So, for example, if you are working with a client who has ADHD and you are not aware of RSD as a coach, that's absolutely huge, because RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, will be absolutely impacting that individual in some shape or form. So when you undergo training along these lines, you have that informed practice. And going back to what we said earlier about intersectionality, that adds a further dimension because, for example, I am a South Asian neurodivergent woman who is also recovering from breast cancer. Those multiple intersecting identities will absolutely require a different kind of approach, which is why I constantly advocate for bringing that kind of intersectional understanding into everything that we do.
I think, Anita, that's absolutely amazing. And I'm feeling that we've got chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 coming up for this podcast with you in the coming months.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Nick and I, when we set up Coaching Loop, which is obviously this podcast is part of that, one of the critical USPs we put in there was individualization. What we wanted to do was structure qualification so it was based around the individual. And I think you've just alluded to that beautifully in terms of almost put it onto the coachee or put it onto the person doing the how do you want us to be during this qualification? How do you want us to be during that coaching? And it's something Nick and I talked quite a bit about on previous podcasts of maybe the first question, how have you arrived today? How have you turned up today? What is it you want from us today in terms of structure, in terms of time, in terms of energy levels, in terms of however that manifests itself for that person? They then get to kind of top end run the session, and then you just become the facilitator rather than the coach. I haven't got space for models today, or I haven't got time to really, really, really drill down into stuff. Don't ever ask me 5 whys today because I don't have capacity for it. I think it's a wonderful thing that everybody can learn from in terms of how do you want that to do. That's really interesting one-to-one. My interest would also be how do you do that one-to-group?
Yeah, absolutely. So when working with teams, I always talk about having a good baseline before we've even started anything. What kind of approach are we taking here? Is it open? Is it neuro-inclusive? Does it take into account different processing and thinking styles? Or is it rigid and very structured and prescriptive? And actually, is the criteria we're using for measuring good performance, is it based on neurotypical standards? So, for example, this team is giving lots of eye contact and thinking on the spot and engaging really well. That's okay, but is it also catering for a few team members who maybe don't have a response immediately on the spot and maybe don't maintain eye contact and sitting still for the whole duration, but later when they've had time to reflect, their problem solving will be way beyond what you could imagine. Their creativity and innovation, if given the space and time, and not deemed to be underperforming because, for example, their performance management criteria is kind of based on, these very dated kind of standards and expectations. And then on a physical level, have you considered your lighting? Have you considered the kind of noise regulation? Have you considered the smells and all of those things that can potentially be quite triggering for a neurodivergent individual? So interestingly, I was working with an organization, and this is what I love when I go back. It's not just a tick box exercise where you've done something during Neurodiversity Celebration Week and then that's it for the rest of the year. So this particular organization, I worked with them for sort of 3 or 4 sessions. And a lot of what we were doing together was then informing a new building that they had plans for. So they said, well, hang on a sec, why don't we have different lighting? Why don't we have certain kind of quiet spaces zoned out that actually look very different and that actually don't have to be fully open plan? We can have a bit of a kind of a mix. So lighting is always the thing I talk about a lot, because spotlights can be quite triggering for neurodivergent individuals. So in our house, we have side lights everywhere. Spotlights are banned. So, it's interesting where you can start to think about the changes you can make in terms of your working practices, but also the surroundings, your environments, and, how conducive they are.
I was just about to say, it comes back to environment again, doesn't it? In
Yes.
terms of what environment do we want people to, or flowers to grow in?
When we have that curious and compassionate approach, and as you say, a growth mindset, because I mentioned earlier about people who receive a formal diagnosis, for example, for their neurodivergence. I always say that's not the end point, because after that, you're constantly learning, you're seeing everything through a new lens, and you're just kind of, you're exploring what life looks like with this understanding. So it's a journey. It's a journey of discovery. And that's what we do as coaches as well. We're never going to get it perfectly right, in inverted commas. The neurodiversity movement as a whole is evolving constantly. So we're trying to move away from deficit, pathologized models and approaches, but that's going to take time. And I think it's really important that we remain curious and we go out and find out what we need to find out about, especially from people who have both professional and lived experience. Because when I talk about RSD, for example, I've lived that. I've experienced what it's done to my life on so many levels. And so, you can contextualize a lot of what you're sharing. And going back to what you said about, how some people sometimes say, we're all on the spectrum, everyone's a bit sort of, so to speak. To an extent, yes, we all think differently. So we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are all neurodiverse, but we're not all neurodivergent. And so the distinction that's created there, where we say that actually that 20% likely to be a bit more, because if we take into account people who don't have a formal diagnosis, people who don't make disclosures, etc. As you mentioned, it's likely to be more than a fifth, which is a significant amount. Neurodivergent people like to kind of hear that they are understood differently. They're not all put into the same category, that actually someone's willing to provide that bespoke support above and beyond, and something that actually is very much catered to their needs so that they can perform their best, or hopefully excel at what they're capable of. So I think it's really important that we consider language. We consider that we are being as neuro-inclusive as possible, and that we check our clients' preferences. So, for example, one of the things to add to that toolkit that you mentioned is, from the very beginning, during those initial conversations with clients, we identify accessibility requirements, but also language preferences. So, for example, some may like to use identity first language. Some may say, I am autistic with ADHD. Some people may say, I have autism or ADHD. Some people may identify as being disabled if they are neurodivergent. Some people choose not to use that term because they believe that they are disabled by society. And so checking those preferences early on. And what you mentioned about sort of having that individualized approach is absolutely key. One extra thing I would suggest is maybe using the right kind of questions as well. Because if you, for example, ask, what support do you need? That person may not be able to answer that because they've had many, many years of not having to advocate for their needs, not being able to, not feeling safe to do so. So a question could be rephrased. It could be, how best can I support you, rather than what support do you need? And as you mentioned, sometimes when you have continuous why questions or continuous curious questions, that might not work for a neurodivergent individual. They may need to have an example somewhere, some kind of reference point, some kind of something that they can actually really believe that's not abstract. So, for example, some autistic people may struggle with a visual sort of metaphor or simile, whereas ADHDers might be absolutely fine to do that. So we've got to kind of understand what that neurotype looks and feels like. And, does that person want something to complement the verbal information? Do they want something dropped into the chat pane if it's an online coaching session? Do they want an infographic? Do they want to be able to do voice notes instead of really, long paragraphs regarding something? So checking those preferences early on can make such a difference, but bearing in mind that that person may not have all of the answers in terms of what they need. So we may need to draw on what we understand, which goes back to the CPD side. If you are undergoing training and you know that typically neurodivergent people can have, whilst everyone's very different, they can have these commonalities. So, for example, we mentioned emotional regulation, energy accounting, executive functioning is another one. Sensory regulation. So that is really key to understand sort of what the differences are. So some neurodivergent people are sensory seeking and some are sensory avoiding. So again, it avoids making those assumptions that all neurodivergent people will want to block everything out. That's not entirely true. Some actually actively seek out things on a sensory level because it gives them what they need. It's fulfilling. So again, checking those sorts of commonalities that you can bring in and say, actually, can you tell me more about this? What are your feelings towards this specifically, rather than a very open question? It kind of gives them that framework.
Anita, thank you so much.
I was just about to say, Nick, my head's exploded already.
This is not the. I don't think we say this quite a lot, but I don't think this is the end of our work together, Anita. This has asked me to challenge myself to be better, which is what Alan and I wanted to do these for. And I hope people listening will feel the same. I've put more notes on my page than in any other session. And I will shut this call out and then go onto the internet and start to buy books and find websites that are going to help me go down some rabbit holes. So thank you so much. Not only have you brought that expertise, but you told me off so beautifully. I've never been told off so nicely. And you've also explained things with real articulation. So can I thank you for being such a great interviewee? I've really got so much out of that selfishly.
Yeah, I'll echo all of that, Anita. That was just huge. And I think the thing I'll take away from it most is we put on our USP to individualize stuff, and you've just articulated that brilliantly, that there is individualization and then there is individualization. The assumptions I think we make, and it's probably something learned assumptions over the years that we've been kind of put onto us in terms of assumptions of neurodiversity rather than neurodivergence. I'm just going to, as of tomorrow, start relationships slightly differently and build those relationships differently. So I can't thank you enough.
Well, I just want to say thank you both. And actually, that was a wonderful example to add to my evidence bank of being completely spontaneous with no notes, no idea of necessarily what's coming in the immediate sense.
Nor do we.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was highly enjoyable. And as you say, it will have a ripple effect in terms of further things we could talk about and explore, which ultimately will benefit our clients and the people around us, our loved ones as well. So I always say this, when I'm delivering these sessions, people start to think about their own sort of family members, friends, people that they might want to kind of, understand better, and they might want to sort of be able to ask a different set of questions, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And I'm really glad, Alan, that you clarified when you said your head was about to explode. It wasn't in a negative way.
No. In a whole positive way. I've got neurons firing that I didn't know I had before. So it's brilliant.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you're interested in learning more about level 3, 5 and 7 coaching and mentoring qualifications, please visit our website, www.coachingloop.co.uk, or email nick@coachingloop.co.uk or alan@, and we will get back to you.